The cardiac monitor in the private ICU wing of the Hartwell estate made a sound like a slow, reluctant clock, each beep dragging out longer than the last, as though the machine itself had grown tired of fighting. Maeve Sutton heard it from the hallway. She had been mopping the same stretch of marble floor for 20 minutes, not because it was dirty, but because she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Through the narrow rectangle of reinforced glass set into the door, she could see the small shape of a child. 4 years old, impossibly pale, tangled in wires and tubes that seemed designed for a body far older than his. His name was Thomas Hartwell III, and he was the sole heir to the largest privately held construction empire in eastern Canada. He hadn't spoken in 8 weeks. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 4. 3 specialists from Toronto General had reviewed his charts and delivered their conclusions in hushed, clinical voices that meant nothing and explained nothing. Selective mutism, they said, trauma response. His body was shutting down not from physical illness, but from a grief so profound it had burrowed into his bones. His grandfather, the man who had raised him from birth after both his parents died in a flooded highway outside of Halifax, had suffered a catastrophic stroke 6 months ago. Ellison Hartwell, the most feared and respected real estate magnate in the province of Nova Scotia, had lain motionless in the east wing of this same house ever since, breathing but absent, while his empire teetered and his only grandchild quietly decided to stop being in the world. Maeve pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass of that door and closed her eyes. She had taken this job 3 weeks ago through a placement agency in Dartmouth that specialized in domestic positions for clients who required discretion and asked few questions. The posting had listed the address only as a coastal estate outside Chester Basin. The pay was obscene. No phones, no photographs, no discussing the household with anyone outside of it. Maeve had agreed to everything without hesitation, because she had run out of options the way you run out of road on a winter highway. Suddenly, completely, with nowhere left to turn. Her younger sister, Delia, was 17 and waiting in a shared rental unit in Dartmouth, with a heating system that cut out every 3rd night, and a landlord who had started appearing at the door unannounced. Their parents were gone. Maeve was 28, and she was everything Delia had. She needed to keep this job. She needed the money. She needed to stay invisible. She was doing very well at being invisible, right up until the evening of her 22nd shift, when the small boy on the other side of that door turned his face toward the glass and looked directly at her. Maeve froze. Thomas Hartwell III had not made eye contact with a single member of the household staff in 2 months. The live-in nurse, Patricia Doyle, had told Maeve this on her first day, in the distracted, exhausted voice of someone who had long since stopped expecting improvement. The boy eats perhaps 50 calories a day, Patricia had said. He sits. He stares at the wall. He does not respond to his name. He does not cry. He has simply gone somewhere the rest of us can't reach him. But he was looking at Maeve now, through the glass, with enormous dark eyes that were red-rimmed and ancient in a 4-year-old's face. And his expression, she couldn't describe it as anything other than recognition. Not of her specifically, of something she was carrying. Something he understood. She had just come from the kitchen, where she had been crying into the prep sink for 10 minutes over a phone call with Delia. The landlord had raised the rent again, effective immediately. She had managed to stop crying before she came back down the corridor, or she thought she had, but she supposed grief had its own smell, its own frequency. Children who have been submerged in it long enough develop a sense for it the way animals develop a sense for weather. Maeve made a decision she could not fully explain, even to herself. She pushed open the door. Patricia was in the adjacent sitting room. Maeve could hear the low murmur of the television through the wall. She crossed the ICU room quietly, weaving around the monitor stand and the IV pole, and pulled the small wooden chair close to the side of the hospital bed. She sat down. She didn't try to speak to him, didn't introduce herself, didn't do any of the gentle coaxing things that the specialists had recommended. She just sat with him the way you sit with someone who has had an unsurvivable loss, because sometimes that is all you can offer, and it is somehow, against all reason, enough. After a moment, Maeve reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a small container. The leftover roasted sweet potato and cheddar she had made herself for dinner on the staff hot plate portioned into a battered plastic container she'd been carrying around for the last hour. She hadn't gotten around to eating it. She set it on the tray table beside Thomas's untouched cup of electrolyte drink and didn't say anything. She didn't offer it to him. She just opened the lid, and the warm, earthy smell drifted out. Nothing happened for a very long time. Then Thomas Hartwell III reached out one thin hand and picked up the small fork. He ate 4 bites. Slowly, with intense concentration, as though eating were a skill he was relearning from scratch. Then he set the fork down and turned his face back toward the wall. But the monitor's rhythm had changed, almost imperceptibly, but Maeve heard it. Steadier, less reluctant. She was still sitting there 10 minutes later when the door to the ICU room opened behind her and a voice said, very quietly and very dangerously, "What are you doing, a question?" The voice had been stripped of every register that a question requires. Maeve stood up slowly and turned around. Rhett Hartwell was 41 years old and looked like a man who had not slept in 6 months because he hadn't. He was the only son of Ellison Hartwell, and he had despised his father for the better part of 2 decades, and he had come back to Chester Basin 6 months ago when his father's stroke left Thomas without anyone else in the world. He was standing in the doorway in dark trousers and a half-untucked dress shirt, carrying the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be very dangerous very calmly. His eyes went from Maeve to his son and then to the tray table where the plastic container sat, its lid open, 4 small fork marks visible in the orange interior of the sweet potato. His jaw moved. Something happened in the region of his eyes that Maeve could not name. He ate, she said, because the silence was becoming unbearable and because it seemed the most important fact available. Rhett Hartwell looked at his son for a long time. Thomas had not moved. He was still facing the wall, but his culfor was fractionally better, the waxy translucence of the past weeks replaced by something almost resembling warmth. "He rejected the nutritional supplements this morning," Rhett said finally. His voice had descended from dangerous into something flatter and harder to read. "He threw the bottle. Patricia said he has never thrown anything before. He was probably exhausted by the fight," Maeve said. "Fighting things you don't want costs a lot of energy when you're small." Rhett turned and looked at her with the particular attention of a man who is accustomed to assessing threats and has just recategorized her into a different column. "Who are you?" he said. "Maeve Sutton." "I started 3 weeks ago. I work the East Wing corridor, floors, linens, kitchen prep on Thursday evenings. Why are you in my son's room?" He looked at me through the glass. She paused. I thought that was probably worth paying attention to. Rhett Hartwell was quiet for long enough that Maeve began to think she was about to be fired, which would be a disaster of a specific and irreversible kind. Then he said, "Get out, I need to speak to Patricia." She got out. She did not, however, go far. She stood in the corridor outside and waited, which she could not have explained, and which turned out to matter. 20 minutes later, Rhett Hartwell came out of the ICU room, pulled the door closed behind him with exaggerated quietness, and stood in the corridor looking at the far wall with the focused blankness of a man performing an urgent calculation. "You're a cleaner," he said without looking at her. "Yes, not a nurse, not a child psychologist, not a grief specialist or a developmental therapist or any of the other 7 professionals I have brought in over the past 4 months. "No," he looked at her then. "Why did he respond to you?" Maeve thought about the phone call and the prep sync and the 10 minutes she hadn't managed to get under control as thoroughly as she'd thought. "I don't know for certain," she said carefully, "but I think he recognized someone who was also having a very bad day. Children who are grieving sometimes find that easier to be around than people who are performing normalcy at them." Rhett Hartwell studied her for a moment with those dark, bruised eyes. Then he said, "My son has a 7 o'clock feeding attempt scheduled for tomorrow morning. Patricia will be there. I want you there as well." "I'm a cleaner," Maeve said. "I am aware of that. I am asking you anyway." He started to walk away. He stopped. "The sweet potato. Where did you get it? Staff hot plate. What's in it? Roasted sweet potato." "Sharp cheddar. A small amount of brown butter. Nothing else." Something crossed his face that she couldn't quite catch. "Make more," he said. "For tomorrow, whatever you had in that container. I'll tell the kitchen to stock whatever you need." He walked away down the corridor and Maeve stood in the dim light of the East Wing and tried to understand what had just happened to her life. The 7 o'clock feeding attempt the next morning was the first of 15 that Maeve attended over the following 3 weeks. She was not Thomas's nurse. She was not his therapist. She was, technically, still a cleaner, and Mr. Hartwell's household manager, a brisk woman named Margaret Foss, who had been running the estate for 11 years, had raised pointed objections about the arrangement that were absorbed and disregarded with equal efficiency. Maeve continued to clean the East Wing corridor. She also, increasingly, sat with Thomas. She did not push him to speak. She did not attempt structured play or therapeutic exercises. She brought food that smelled warm and real, and that she made herself. Mashed parsnip with apple and a touch of cream, soft scrambled eggs with chives from the kitchen garden, small bowls of oatmeal with stewed blueberries that she picked up from a farm stall outside Chester Basin on her days off. She sat with him and ate some of it herself, unhurriedly, talking occasionally about nothing in particular. The fog on the harbor that morning, the fact that the kitchen cat had been chasing something under the refrigerator again, the specific problem of matching socks when you're in a hurry. Thomas ate. Not much, at first, but consistently and more each week. On the 18th day, he said a word. It was not directed at Maeve, exactly. It seemed directed more at the middle distance above the tray table, but it was a word, small and rusty from disuse. He said, "Blueberries," and then appeared slightly surprised at himself and went back to eating. Maeve did not make a significant event of this. She said, "Yes, those are the ones," and handed him another small spoon, and the moment passed without collapsing under its own weight. She told Rhett Hartwell that evening. He was in the corridor outside the ICU room, which was where she was coming to understand he spent a significant amount of time. Standing outside the door, his son was behind, too afraid of disturbing something fragile to go in, and too unable to leave to actually go anywhere else. "One word," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he sat down abruptly on the chair that someone had placed in the corridor for exactly this purpose, and put his hands over his face. Maeve stood there and gave him a minute. "I did not expect to feel this," he said finally from behind his hands. "Most people don't," she said. "Relief is always bigger than you budget for." He lowered his hands. He looked at her in that recategorizing way again, and Maeve had the uncomfortable sensation of being very clearly seen by someone who was accustomed to seeing through everything. "You have a sister," he said. It wasn't quite a statement, and wasn't quite a question. Maeve went carefully still. "You mentioned her." "In the room, once. You were talking about nothing in particular. I think you were describing matching socks, and you said your sister has the same problem, that she loses the left ones specifically." She remembered it now. She had been talking to fill the silence, and she had not been paying attention to what she was saying. "She's 17, Maeve said, because it seemed pointless to deny it. "She's in Dartmouth. She's fine. I employ people from that agency, specifically because they are not fine," Rhett Hartwell said. "That is the point of the arrangement. No questions asked. They are usually running from something." Maeve looked at him steadily. "And that's acceptable to you?" "It is preferable," he said calmly, "because people who are running from something understand what it costs to keep moving, and they are reliably discreet. I am not criticizing you, Miss Sutton. I am telling you that I know your situation is likely more complicated than it appears, and that I have the resources to make it less complicated in exchange for your continued presence in my son's life." The offer should have felt transactional and cold. Somehow it didn't entirely. Maeve thought this was because he had said it without any pretense of generosity. Just a direct accounting of what each of them had and what each of them needed. "My sister needs stable housing," Maeve said. "The landlord is shaking us down. The place has a broken heating system and I can't get him to fix it. Give the address to Margaret Foss," Rhett said. "It will be handled. I'm not asking for charity. It is not charity. It is a structural repair to a rental property to bring it to code, and pressure applied to a landlord who is operating outside of it. I have lawyers for that. It costs me nothing." He stood up. "You are not staff anymore, Miss Sutton. You are Thomas's caregiver. Your rate doubles, effective today. Your sister will have a safe place to live. You have my protection while you are on this property." He looked at her steadily. "Those are the terms. Do you accept?" Maeve thought about Delia in the cold apartment. She thought about the heating system and the landlord at the door. She thought about the small boy in the room behind them who had said blueberries today and who she was not prepared to walk away from, no matter what else was true. "I accept," she said. She did not, in the weeks that followed, allow herself to think too carefully about Rhett Hartwell as a person. This was a practical choice. The household was large and complicated, and she had a job to do, and he was a man who ran a billion-dollar construction empire from the estate's private office suite, and who had the particular exhausted intensity of someone operating permanently at the edge of his capacity. They were not friends. They were not anything. He asked her questions about Thomas in the evenings. What the boy had eaten, what he had said, whether he had responded to anything new, and she answered them. And occasionally they talked about other things, and she noticed that she was beginning to look forward to those conversations in a way she did not examine too carefully. Thomas began to speak in full sentences in his 5th week under Maeve's care. He asked for things. More blueberries, a specific book about harbor seals that lived on the bookshelf in the sitting room, the particular blanket from the window seat rather than the one on the bed. His appetite improved steadily. He began to leave the ICU wing on his own initiative, appearing in the kitchen in the mornings with the uncertain determination of a small person reclaiming territory. Maeve noticed other things, too. She noticed that Thomas watched the door of his grandfather's room when he thought no one was looking. She noticed that he had begun asking oblique, Careful questions about what happened when people didn't wake up. The kind of questions that 4-year-olds ask when they are trying to understand something enormous, and have correctly intuited that the adults around them will give them soft answers rather than real ones. She noticed, most significantly, that Anthea Drummond-Voss had begun visiting the estate. Anthea Drummond-Voss was 43, the daughter of Ellison Hartwell's oldest business partner, a corporate attorney who had represented the Hartwell Group for 20 years. She arrived for the first time on a Saturday in late autumn, dressed in a way that suggested she had thought carefully about how to look as though she hadn't thought carefully about it. She brought flowers for the foyer and a bottle of aged Scotch for Rhett, and spent 4 hours in the estate's main drawing room before leaving, and Maeve clocked the entire visit from the East Wing corridor with a feeling she refused to label. Anthea came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. Maeve began to pay attention in the specific heightened way of someone who has survived an abusive situation, by learning to read the air in a room before anything has been said out loud. She watched Anthea with Thomas. The way the woman's smile didn't quite reach her cheekbones when the boy appeared, the way her hand, placed briefly on Thomas's shoulder during a greeting, withdrew a fraction of a second too quickly. She watched Anthea in the drawing room with Rhett, the way she leaned into the conversation about the estate's finances with a precision that suggested she had done significant research beforehand. And then, one Thursday evening in the 3rd week of November, Maeve was in the kitchen garden cutting the last of the autumn herbs when she heard voices through the partially open window of the estate's study. She was not eavesdropping. She was standing perfectly still because motion would have indicated her presence to the people inside. Rhett's voice, carefully neutral. "He's made remarkable progress." The specialist from Dalhousie confirmed it this week. Anthea's voice, equally careful. "Remarkable. Although, and I say this only because I care about what's best for Thomas, do you think it's wise, relying this heavily on someone you know essentially nothing about?" She came through that agency. She did. The agency caters to a specific clientele, Rhett. People with complicated backgrounds. People who have reason to avoid scrutiny. Yes, and you're not concerned. I was, Rhett said. I had Silas run a full background check 3 weeks in. Record. Younger sister. Parents deceased. Previous employment at a daycare center in Cole Harbour and a care home in Lower Sackville. She has no reason to be here other than the one she gave. He paused. Thomas trusts her. I trust Thomas. There was a small silence. Your father's condition has stabilized somewhat, Anthea said, pivoting in a way that was not quite smooth enough to be casual. The estate will need to consider its legal structure going forward. If the trust holding the property is restructured before Thomas's 5th birthday, the tax position for the family becomes significantly cleaner. I've had my firm run a preliminary analysis. I'm aware, Rhett said. The analysis also shows, and the partners agree, that the cleanest outcome for the estate would be a streamlined chain of succession. Ellison isn't coming back, Rhett. Eventually you'll need to acknowledge that, for Thomas's sake as much as anyone's. Maeve stood very still in the dark of the kitchen garden, and the cold Atlantic air moved around her, and something resolved in her chest with the clarity of a bone snapping cleanly. She knew what she had just heard. Not all of it, not the specific mechanism, not the legal architecture of whatever Anthea Drummond-Voss was engineering, but the shape of it, the direction of it. And the fact that Thomas, a 4-year-old boy who was only just beginning to eat again and say words again, was the thing standing at the center of it, small and unknowing and in the way. She went inside. She went to the kitchen and made Thomas's breakfast for the next morning. She went to the ICU wing and checked that the monitor was on its usual rhythm. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and tried to think with the part of her brain that didn't panic. 3 days later, she found the bottles. She was cleaning the medical storage room adjacent to the ICU wing, her regular Thursday task, when she noticed that the sealed case of the specialized liquid nutrition supplement had been disturbed. Thomas had been off the supplements for 2 weeks now. Maeve had confirmed with Patricia that the case should be sealed and untouched. The tamper seal on one of the bottles had been partially re-adhered, the edges not quite flush. Someone who wasn't looking for it would have missed it. Someone who had spent the last 6 weeks hypervigilant about everything Thomas put in his body did not miss it. Maeve did not pick it up with her bare hands. She wrapped it in a cleaning cloth and set it aside, and she stood in the middle of the storage room for a very long time, thinking about the conversation through the study window, thinking about Anthea Drummond-Voss's hand leaving Thomas's shoulder too quickly, thinking about the legal structure of a trust and what happened to Hartwell Group assets if the heir was no longer in the picture. She went to find Patricia. Patricia Doyle was a registered nurse with 20 years of experience and a practiced inability to be surprised by anything. but she listened to Maeve with narrowing eyes, and when Maeve finished, Patricia said, "There's a chemist I know in Halifax who does private toxicology. We can have a result in 6 hours if I call her now." They called her now. The result came back in the early hours of the following morning. The supplement had been laced with a compound that, administered in small daily doses over an extended period, would mimic the progressive neurological withdrawal that Thomas's doctors had been interpreting as worsening trauma response. Not immediately lethal, slow, designed to look like the natural deterioration of a deeply grieving child. Maeve sat with that knowledge in the kitchen while the house slept, and she was not afraid, exactly. She was something colder and more functional than fear. She thought about Thomas saying blueberries in his rusty, surprised voice. She thought about what it had cost him to come back from wherever grief had taken him. She thought about the fact that someone in this house had been pulling him back under, deliberately, patiently, every single day. She picked up her phone, and she walked through the east corridor and up the private staircase to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door of Rhett Hartwell's study. It took him 45 seconds to answer, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. He opened the door in dark trousers and a grey shirt, his hair disheveled, and took one look at her face and stood aside to let her in without a word. She told him everything. The tampered seal, Patricia's contact, the toxicology result, the conversation in the kitchen garden. She set the printed lab report on his desk without editorializing. Rhett read it. He was very still throughout. Then he set the report down, placed both hands flat on the desk surface, and looked at the middle distance for a long time. "How long have you known about Anthea?" he said finally. "I've had concerns for 3 weeks," Maeve said carefully. The conversation was the first concrete indication. The bottle was the confirmation. "You should have come to me immediately." "I didn't have proof at that point. I had a feeling and a concern, and you're a man who makes decisions based on evidence. I went and got you the evidence first." He looked at her then, the same recategorizing look, slower this time. "Who else knows?" he said. "Patricia. The chemist in Halifax, but Patricia trusts her absolutely. Can Patricia secure the bottle in a location outside of this estate by morning?" "Yes, tell her to do that." He straightened. The boardroom portion of his mind had clearly engaged, overlaying the shock with the kind of deliberate structural clarity that made very large companies run. "Anthea will be at the estate Sunday afternoon. She is expected for dinner. I want her here. I want this contained, and I want it documented, and I want the commission of whatever investigation follows to be unambiguous." "How?" Maeve said. "I'm going to allow her to believe she has won something." He moved to the window, the lights of the Chester Basin Harbor faint and scattered in the dark below. "The estate's legal review is scheduled for Monday. I have been apparently the subject of a sustained campaign to present me as a grieving, vulnerable widower whose son is declining and who is in need of a strong legal advocate with ties to the family. I am going to play the part. I am going to invite Anthea to the dinner on Sunday as someone who has come to believe she is about to become indispensable." Maeve stared at him. "That's very cold." "Yes," he said simply. "And if she guesses, if she moves on Thomas before Sunday?" "Thomas doesn't leave Maeve's sight until this is resolved," Rhett said, and the directness of it, the uncomplicated certainty with which he placed her between his son and a threat, made Maeve's breath catch in her throat. "Maeve," she said. He looked at her. "You said my name instead of Ms. Sutton." Something shifted in his expression. Not embarrassment exactly, but the awareness of having done something he had not planned. "I did," he said. The moment held for long enough to matter, and then Maeve said, "I'll go tell Patricia," and she left. The following 72 hours were some of the most exhausting of Maeve's life, which was saying something, given the competition. She did not leave Thomas's side except to sleep, and she slept light, in the sitting room adjacent to his, with the door open between them. Thomas, sensing the alteration in her attention without understanding it, pressed close and became more talkative rather than less, filling the heightened atmosphere with a steady stream of observations about harbor seals and blueberries and the specific wrongness of the kitchen cat's expression when it had been scolded. Maeve took notes on all of it. In a small book she kept in her uniform pocket, not because it was therapeutically indicated, but because she had the feeling that this period, this specific window of Thomas Hartwell III coming back into the world, was something that deserved to be written down. Sunday evening arrived with a cold offshore wind and a sky that had gone white with the threat of early snow. Anthea Drummond Voss arrived at 6:15 in a cream wool coat and carrying a bottle of Bordeaux. Maeve had been installed, at Rhett's explicit instruction, in the dining room in a capacity that was openly ambiguous, not quite staff, not quite guest, present and visible and impossible to dismiss. Anthea's expression when she saw Maeve at the dining table did something small and controlled and revealing. "I didn't realize dinner was a larger gathering," she said pleasantly to Rhett. "I wanted Maeve here," Rhett said simply. "She's become important to Thomas, and to the household." Maeve watched Anthea recalibrate and file the information away. They ate. The conversation was careful and social, and periodically tested something invisible. Anthea praised Thomas's color, his improved appetite, his evident recovery. And Maeve noticed that the praise was delivered with a particular texture, as though recovery were something unexpected, something that had not been part of the plan. After dessert, Rhett said, "I've been thinking about your suggestion regarding the trust, the restructuring before Thomas's 5th birthday." Anthea's eyes sharpened with a tension she almost concealed. "I think it makes a great deal of sense. For the family, I'd like to discuss the specifics," Rhett said. "Would you be comfortable if I recorded the conversation? My own notes have been scattered. The last 6 months have been difficult to document properly." Anthea paused for a fraction of a second. "Of course," she said. What followed was 35 minutes of conversation that Maeve listened to from her position at the dining table, during which Anthea Drummond-Voss, confident and meticulous and entirely certain she was managing a grieving, distracted man who didn't know what she knew, laid out in precise and incriminating detail the legal mechanism by which the Hartwell Group estate would transfer to the Romano-Drummond family partnership in the event of Thomas's death before his 5th birthday. She spoke about the supplement schedule she had asked Beatrice Coyne, the estate's former live-in nurse, dismissed weeks ago, to implement. She spoke about the expected timeline of Thomas's decline. She spoke about her firm's involvement in structuring the trust documents. She did not realize until Rhett reached over and stopped the recording and set it on the table between them, that she had been speaking into a device that was feeding live audio to 3 of the Hartwell Group's senior legal counsel, who were currently sitting in the estate's West Wing office with a provincial crown prosecutor who had been contacted 48 hours prior. Anthea Drummond-Voss went very still. "You have one opportunity to provide a full accounting," Rhett said. The social register had completely left his voice. What remained was the version of him that had built a billion-dollar empire from a fractured family name. Quiet, absolute. The crown is here. The evidence is documented. You can cooperate with the investigation or you can leave this house in restraints. Those are the options I am offering you. You can't, Anthea began. Beatrice Coyne was interviewed yesterday morning, Rhett said. She has provided a full statement in exchange for consideration. She named you. She named your firm's managing partner. She named the account at Scotiabank in which the payment was arranged. His voice did not rise. You are finished, Anthea. The only question remaining is how much of what you have left is salvageable. Anthea Drummond-Voss's immaculate composure came apart in a way that Maeve found both terrible and clarifying. The way things that have been constructed to look like one thing reveal themselves to be something entirely different when the pressure reaches a certain point. She did not shout or rage. She simply seemed to diminish, collapsing inward, the architecture of her confidence dismantled from within. By the time the Crown prosecutor and the legal team came through from the West Wing, Anthea had begun to speak. She spoke for a long time. Later, much later, when the estate had been cleared of everyone who needed to be cleared out of it, and the paperwork that needed to be filed had been filed, and the quiet of the house had settled back down around them like snow, Maeve found herself standing at the window of the dining room, looking out at the harbor lights below. She heard Rhett come back into the room. She did not turn around. "Thomas is asleep," Rhett said. He asked Patricia to leave the light on in the harbor seal book corner. She said she wasn't sure what that meant. "It means the corner of the sitting room with the window seat," Maeve said. "He's arranged the seal books in a specific order. It's important to him. I'll show Patricia in the morning." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "You've learned an extraordinary amount about my son in a very short time," he told me, Maeve said. "I just listened." She heard him cross the room. He came to stand beside her at the window, not quite close enough to touch, looking out at the same dark harbor. "Beatrice Coyne was installed by Anthea 6 months ago," Rhett said, "before I came back. She had been administering the compound since shortly after my father's stroke. Thomas was already declining before any of the specialists were called." He stopped. "All of it. Every doctor I consulted, every treatment that failed. He wasn't declining from grief, he was being poisoned. In my own house. While I was standing 6 feet outside his door every night thinking I had failed him." Maeve turned to look at him. His face in profile was exhausted and ancient and, right now, without any of the armor. "You didn't fail him," she said. "I hired Beatrice Coyne. You hired her in good faith. That's not the same thing. I should have seen you were watching a child shut down and trying to find every medical explanation available and running an empire from a private estate in Nova Scotia. while your father lay dying 2 rooms away, Maeve said. The thing that was happening was designed to be invisible, designed by people with resources and motivation and time. You found it. Thomas is eating and talking and sleeping with his light on in the harbor seal corner. That is what you did. Rhett was very still. Why are you? He started. Because it's true, Maeve said simply. He turned to look at her properly then, was the longest and most thorough version of that look yet, and this time she didn't look away. You have somewhere to be, he said eventually. It wasn't dismissive. It was uncertain, which she had not heard from him before. Not particularly, she said. Delia is 17 and entirely capable of one evening without a check-in. She paused. She texted me an hour ago to say the heating system has been working perfectly for 3 weeks and that the landlord has suddenly become very cooperative about everything. The corner of his mouth moved. She had not seen that before either. I may have had a conversation with him, Rhett said. I suspected you might have. The harbor lights below were small and scattered, and the first snow of the season had begun to come down, light and slow, drifting past the window in the way that it does on the Nova Scotia coast in early December, when it seems less like weather and more like the atmosphere making a considered decision. I owe you a great deal, Rhett said quietly. You don't owe me anything. I was here. Thomas needed someone to be here. She looked out at the snow. That's all it was at the beginning. And now, he said, it wasn't quite a question, but she answered it anyway. Now I have a harbor seal book corner to explain to Patricia in the morning, she said, and a child who is going to want blueberry oatmeal at 7 o'clock and who is not going to wait patiently for it. Rhett looked at her for a long time. Then he said, stay, for as long as you want to stay. You are not staff. You are not an arrangement. You are the person who brought my son back into the world, and whatever else you are after that, whatever that becomes, it is entirely up to you. Maeve looked at the snow falling past the harbor lights and thought about Delia warm in the apartment, in Dartmouth and Thomas asleep with his light on beside the carefully ordered seal books. And she thought about what it meant to have come from nothing and running and arrived, somehow in a place where someone spoke to her in terms of what she wanted rather than what she was worth. Blueberry oatmeal, she said after a moment. 7 o'clock. I'll need to soak the oats tonight. The smallest, most unguarded smile she had ever seen on Rhett Hartwell's face crossed it briefly and was gone. Then we'd better go make sure the kitchen has oats, he said. They left the window together, and the snow kept falling outside over the Chester Basin harbor, quiet and deliberate, the way good things sometimes arrive. Without announcement, without drama, after a very long time of being waited for, without quite knowing what it was you were waiting for. Thomas Hartwell III ate 3 full bowls of blueberry oatmeal the next morning, complained at length about the harbor seal book being on the wrong shelf, and told Patricia Doyle, with considerable confidence, that the kitchen cat's name was Gerald and that everyone had been calling it the wrong thing for years. It was, by any measure, an excellent morning,